Well, hello, ladies and friends. Simone here, Director of Program Growth, and I'm with Dwyer and Stephanie Burke yet again. And we are on chapter 4, The Pilgrimage to Rome, which is one of my favorite chapters. And this week, Stephanie will be guiding our discussion. Thanks, Stephanie.
It's great to be back and talking about, I think, probably my favorite saint again. I just love Therese. So before we jump into this idea of holy daring with what she did in the Pope, I want to talk about first, this is a quote from Story of the Soul, where she says, "The divine call was so strong that had I been forced to pass through flames, I would have done it out of love for Jesus," right? I think that kind of sets this up to this, to this holy daring of hers. And I think it's just remarkable that she's 14 and she's knows so unquestionably that she's called to be a nun. She's called to enter Carmel. And so she's got to break the news to her father, who she knows she's the queen of his heart, his little queen, right? And yet with so much confidence, and it goes back to this transition from child to this woman of prayer, this woman of purpose, this woman of call that she'd stepped into, that at 14 she can go to her father and, knowing it's going to break his heart, gently, lovingly say, "I'm supposed to go to Carmel, I'm being called," right? And it's just beautiful. And what I love is that through his tears, then, he starts to help devise the plan to get her there, right? We're going to go to Mother Superior. She says, no, we're going to go to the bishop. If he says, no, we're going to go to the Pope, right? And I just love it. There's this scene that I think um, really sets us up for what does it mean to follow the Lord with abandonment, holy fire, holy daring, right? Knowing I'm on God's path and I can't let anything stop me. And that's when she's right before the Pope and she gets this glare from the priest that's there, that's accompanying them on the pilgrimage. And they're told, "You cannot speak to the Holy Father." And her sister looks at her and goes, "Speak, speak," and they're just so incredibly just like adult and childlike at the same time. It's really quite a remarkable thing. To be standing amongst all these dignitaries, all these really extraordinary people, big chairs. She even talked about the size of the chairs and everything, and how it was totally intimidating. And yet, with that holy daring, nothing would stop her. And she begs the Holy Father to, not only once, but she begs him 3 times to give her permission to enter Carmel at 15. So I just think there's something there for us to all really learn as women. Particular is that when we know something to be true, good, holy, and right, and of the Lord, right? If we can connect it to Galatians 5, if we know it's not against faith or morals, but it's truly what's good and right and holy, and we believe that the Lord's calling us to it, then to go forward in holy confidence, right? Sometimes, it's just an extraordinary adventure when you start following the Lord with all that you are. And I described it the other day. It's a little bit like running, and you're running across a bridge that doesn't have planks on it, and you're running so fast that the Lord keeps dropping the planks right as your feet go down.
Nice.
And you just feel like you're chasing after the Lord. And I think we must remember that the Lord's delight is man fully alive. He
Mm-hmm.
desires us to be fully alive, following his will with that holy daring to follow him, to be extraordinary. So that's what I'd open it up with.
I think it's my favorite line of Therese when she, what does he say? What does the Pope say? You know, he basically says, like, just do what your superiors tell you to do. And she goes, oh, Holy Father, if you say yes, everyone will agree. Like, I think it's so charming. Like, you've got all the power. You could make this happen for me if you wanted to. Come on. I love that. That's all I have to say at this moment. I think she's just so real. And she like grabs his knees. Like she like leans in harder, from the feet to the knees to like the pleading and the. Yeah. This is my favorite moment of Therese.
He really was taking a risk too, in more ways than one, because of course he could say no. And if he had said no, that would have shut the door. There would have been no more debate, because if the Pope had said no, then there would be no opportunity for there to be a yes. But the other thing was that I had read that this, the priest that they were traveling with, the Vicar General, I'm going to butcher their names, Father Reveroni, he had been told by Therese's bishop, who ultimately held her future in his hands, to watch her during that trip, to see if she really did have a vocation and if she was mature enough to enter. Oh. And so there he is standing there. And so she's about to break the rules in front of the man who's supposed to report to the bishop if she really has a calling. So, there's just a lot of layers there of holy audacity and of kind of risking it all, like in this moment, and having the courage to know that it could really go either way for her, but she was putting her future in God's hands.
Yeah. I think what we can also learn from that, because this could have gone terribly wrong, right? What she was doing was centered on love for the Lord. It wasn't sinful. Was it impetuous? Yes. Was it audacious? Yes. All of that. But it wasn't sinful. And I think that's where, the distinction is. And I love it because we can learn to petition the Lord. We can learn to go to the Lord in the way that she went to the Holy Father, with holy daring. Lord, I know that you desire the good for this person. I know that it is your will that X, Y, saved, right? So I'm coming guns blazing. I'm pulling out all the stops. I'm going to remind you of their baptism. I'm going to remind you of the holy seeds that you've planted in their souls. Bring them to fruition, right? With this incredible, just holy daring of, if you say, right? And I loved that they made the connection of the woman who comes saying, he says, why should, to Jesus, that she's a Gentile. And he said, why should I give to the dogs what is, meant for those at table? And she says, oh, but even we deserve scraps, the audaciousness to press forward and say, help me, right? And he does so, that pushing forward of faith, the holy daring of faith completely alive, saying, Lord, I know it's your will that we all be saved. So I'm giving you all of my fire, all of my prayer, all of my sacrifices for the sake of, the salvation of souls. So, yeah.
I love how it seems like an I Love Lucy episode where the papal guards are like taking on her. Like crying her off as she's crying. But
it's such a great picture.
Right? Like she's just like, but I
wonder if she drug her feet.
Right, exactly. Like
there's Celine following behind, like Ethel.
I wonder if she played spaghetti, right? Did she play spaghetti? Did she just turn into a puddle? Exactly. It's hilarious.
But I remember my mother trying to like develop this quality in me, if I asked something and she said no, she wanted me, I remember that, wanted me to keep asking, to like grow that persistence. I really appreciate that about my mother, that she, don't be so lukewarm. You have the desire, like, let's see how hard let's see if you really want it,
And we have to appreciate too, like the Pope, not dismissing her, giving her his full attention, getting on her level, and yet he defers to those who have more immediate jurisdiction for her, which is very Catholic. Yes, I could make this really easy for you, but you have a bishop and he's in charge of this whole decision. And I've appointed him, and I in effect defer to him.
Yeah.
And it's scriptural too. Like, don't go to the top if you can go to the person you need to go to and talk to. Like, you need to start at the appropriate level, and the church has these layers of authority in this whole structure, and we obey and we operate within that. So not that she did anything wrong by going to him, but he just kind of brings her back down and says, if it's meant to happen, it'll happen in the order the church has set for these things, and in the context that I've already, that we already have. So
yeah, the principle of subsidiarity within the church.
Mm-hmm.
And humility of Pope Leo, because he was a saint. You know, his humility at that, didn't need to dole out executive orders. My thought is, I wonder when he looked at her, did he know, like, did he receive a word of knowledge that she was going to be a great saint? I mean, because these are like two saints having this encounter. Was he laughing about this at dinner that night? Like, can you believe what this little girl grabbing my knees, being dragged away by, I make up that, like, he chuckled about that later, or that he knew. Because he was prophetic, obviously. I mean, this is the guy who had a vision of hell and wrote the St. Michael prayer and ordered that we pray it at the end of masses,
I read that. So later in that same afternoon or whatever, when they're meeting the Pope, then the women went first, and then the priests, and then the other men. So Therese's father got to also meet the Holy Father, but he was not there during this scene, and he did not see it. So it's his turn, and he comes before the Pope, and the Vicar General there from Dijon, who's with, or not Dijon, but Lisieux, who's with them, says to the Pope, like, Your Holiness, like, this is the father of 2 Carmelites. But he does not mention that he's also the father of the little girl throwing the tantrum he had just met. He just decided to avoid that. But he does introduce Therese's father as a father of 2 Carmelites. And we didn't talk about the sacrifice that he was making. Well, we did, we touched on it, but I mean, her father, who had suffered so much and lost so much already, I suppose it was this process of continual detachment. He lost his wife, his 2 oldest daughters. I mean, to enter a Carmelite convent, it really is in many ways a death. Like, you will never have this person in your life the same way again. They're for you, but they're not with you anymore. Leonie has at this point gone to the convent and come back twice. Like, who knows what's going on with her? She's trying to make this vocation work. And then Therese, like Stephanie said, the little darling wants to go. And his heart, like his broken, open, ready to give it all heart. I just am so touched by his generosity of spirit. And like, I always will bring it back to this contrast with Elizabeth of the Trinity. We can appreciate this when we see in lives, maybe even our own lives, where there is this grasping sense. So Elizabeth's mother was also widowed and only had 2 daughters. And Elizabeth comes and says, I have a vocation. I want to enter Carmel. And her mother says, no, not only no, but you're not allowed to talk to the Carmelites, go to mass at the convent. This subject is closed. I want to hear nothing more of it.
Wow.
So parents of saints have different reactions, and it just makes us appreciate that much more, like her father is so generous.
Well, and he felt that call to celibacy. I mean, it wasn't his calling, obviously, but I make up in my imagination that even though he didn't have that call, he had that desire. So that detachment, that sacrifice, but also that understanding of how she must have been feeling, you know.
Yeah, I think he was, the way she describes him, denotes what an extraordinary example he was to her, and how he helped form, her own sanctity, right? By his example. Because here, by the end, he went from crying to then celebrating the honor it was that so many of his daughters had been called to Carmel. Yeah. He was recognizing that it was and I think, if we go back to this moment of her begging the Pope, and the Pope sends her off, and she thinks, I've surrendered everything to the Lord. I've done all that I know to do, and here I am empty-handed. And she talks about herself she wanted to be the play ball of the Lord, that he could do with her whatever he wanted to, and he could play with her, or he could set her aside and forget about her, or, pierce her and leave her for nothing. She wanted to give herself over to him completely. And so at this point, she's realized he's done this, and now he's pierced me and he's left me. And I have nothing. I have to be completely surrendered. But that was an extraordinary dying of self that I think is so important for all of us to emulate and to understand and to imitate. That she said, I begged Jesus to break my bonds, and he broke them, but in a way totally different from what I expected. The beautiful feast of Christmas arrived, and Jesus did not awaken. He left his little ball on the ground with not so much as casting a glance at it. And there was great fruit that was born in that, right? There's great fruit when we say, I've done all that I know to do. And Lord, I surrender all to you, and I give it to you according to your pleasure, because that's complete surrender to God's divine providence. That's what bears extraordinary fruit. And I think that's really when we start to see exceeding fruit born in our lives, when we decide to just do what we can, but in the end, it's his, right?
Yeah. And I think that so often we want to piously jump to the well, your will, God, before all that, it's not sincere. Of course, I'm speaking of myself, right? If I'm saying, oh, but your will be done, I'm like, I don't actually mean that. I would like for you to do what I wish. It's only after I've exhausted myself in prayer and have seen enough signs that he's trustworthy, I'm like, okay, now I'll surrender this situation to you. I think what I love is the authenticity of Thérèse, where she's like, okay, I've done it. And now, Lord, it's really up to you. And then, like you said, Stephanie, don't leave 5 minutes before the miracle, as they say, because it is. Just hold on.
I love that. Don't leave 5 minutes before the miracle. That's awesome.
My friend Thérèse, named after Thérèse, says that all the time. She calls me, after I've done some hardcore spiritual venting, he's either God or he's not, but he is. So don't leave 5 minutes before the miracle. Okay. Thank you. My own personal little flower. But it was actually, I need to tell you ladies about this. I don't think I've told either of you this. I had this encounter with an atheist on a plane ride and to the Middle East. And, 12 hours sitting next to an atheist, you could have a lot of fun. And he was telling me that, again, secular atheist guy, he's over the whole, I'm paraphrasing, fruits of the sexual revolution. And he's very happily single and almost happier than when he was in relationships. And it's this strange thing. And so I took that as an opportunity to tell him about how in the Catholic Church, there's this whole thing called a call to celibacy. So it's not just a default, it's actually an ideal. And he was just absolutely unbelievably fascinated. So then I started telling him about my lay celibate friends who evangelized me and all that. he couldn't believe it. He just couldn't believe it. I mean, there's so many things we used to evangelize. I have never used celibacy before. Anyway, I'm going to introduce him to some celibate friends. Let's see what happens.
Let's see what happens.
What happens.
Yeah. Well, I don't know how we're doing on time, but, I think to that end, the greatest surrender is surrendering our self-will to God's will, the mortification of our ego and what we think should happen. It goes back to that, if you want to hear God laugh, tell him about your plan. And so I just think it's important that we can't overcorrect and mortify ourselves into a state of bitterness and emptiness. That's not holy. Holy is the giving over of our will to the Lord's will, and to live it joyfully, freely, with holy daring, but always with our eyes on him, not on what we want or how we think things are going to be. So,
and that's often why God allows these delays and these obstacles, because ultimately, even more precious to him than the vocation of Thérèse or Elizabeth, who had to wait years, not just months, was their surrender. He wanted their will to be aligned with his. And then once it was right, it was like, okay, now that we've got that right, I will open the doors for you to give your life to me, now that you've actually given your life to me. Because that's the harder death, is the death to your self-will, rather than the death to the world sometimes, right? They thought they knew what it was to die to the world. They wanted to give everything over, but the Lord, first of all, wanted them to give their will. And then once they had, then he opened the doors of the convent, and they could leave the rest of the world behind once that, precious part of them had been allowed to die.
And I think, I think the thing that makes that bearable is that it's for joy, right? It's not because like, oh, just so you know, just want you to remember that I'm God, but to increase joy, which is what makes the surrender reasonable, right?
Well, and desirable, right? It becomes completely Marian.
Yeah.
Because if we go back to Our Lady, the reason we honor and venerate her so much is because she had the free will to say no.
Yeah.
But she said, yes, thy will be done according to your word. So that fiat, that complete giving over of self, brought about our salvation, right? Her cooperation, her yes, brought about an extraordinary means of salvation that would not have been possible without her. So all of this is also very Marian.
Yeah.
So much to learn.
So much in this chapter. I love this chapter, and I love that story. Something else I wanted to share, but I can't think of it right. Oh, I had another interesting encounter. Well, then I suppose we can all say goodbye as the time runs out, with a very young girl who has now decided to discern religious life. And she admitted to me that she really did know when she was a teenager, Therese's age. So I had these two encounters recently, and I thought, here's somebody who has the privilege of growing up in a Catholic context where that's weird, but not weird. And here's this other person that, had they grown up in a Christian context, they would have the explanation for what they're actually experiencing existentially. So just fascinating. Just all the more encouragement for me to evangelize the gospel, because how incredible is it to be that person that introduced this idea of celibacy being an ideal, and he's like Googling St. Paul now. So how cool is that? It's just like very cool.
May he come all the way in, the water's fine.
No, he's on my list. Not that he's a project, but anyways, anything else, ladies, before we say goodbye? There's still a few more minutes if we want them. Halfway through the study. No? Okay. Well, see you next week.
Okay.
Bye-bye.